The air in Glacier National Park in mid-July usually hums with the promise of summer. The buzz of insects, the distant rumble of rockfall, the whisper of wind through ancient pines. But high above the usual trails where jagged peaks tore at the sky and glaciers clung to the shadowed cirques, a different kind of silence often settled. It was a silence vast and ancient, a patient breath drawn over millennia, tasting of cold stone and pine, carrying the faint, metallic scent of snow even in the warmest months. Sunlight, when it found purchase, spilled like liquid gold across the alpine meadows, but even this brilliance felt indifferent, illuminating a world that had existed long before human concerns and would continue long after. It was into this magnificent, uncaring expanse that Mark Castellano and Jennifer Whitmore, two bright sparks of human connection, stepped on July 15th, 2019, ready to embrace its beauty. By sundown 3 days later, the silence would have deepened, and the mountains would have begun to tell a story no one could understand. They arrived at the Belly River Ranger Station with the morning sun, two figures forged from the very landscape they loved. Mark Castellano, at 38, moved with a lean, purposeful grace, his frame strong from countless miles on backcountry trails. His brown hair, usually swept back from his brow, now fell into his kind, intelligent eyes as he studied the map tacked to the ranger's wall. A slight scar above his left eyebrow, a faded testament to a life lived fully, close to the edge. Beside him, Jennifer Whitmore, 36, possessed a wiry strength that belied her gentle demeanor. Her auburn hair was pulled back from a face alive with curiosity, her deep forest moss eyes quick to observe, slow to judge. They were Seattle's seasoned outdoor enthusiasts, not merely visitors, but participants in the wilderness. This was no ordinary trek. This was an engagement celebration, a 3-day journey along the remote Ptarmigan Tunnel Trail, a path they knew well. Their packs, meticulously organized, stood tall beside them, a testament to Mark's pragmatic anchor, his meticulous checking of gear, his unwavering adherence to backup plans. Jennifer, ever the more contemplative, carried a small leather-bound journal, her fingers already smudged with ink from sketching the morning light. Her voice, softer than Mark's, often trailed off into thought but held a surprising intensity when she spoke of the mountains, of the profound connection she found in their ancient solitude. They greeted the ranger with easy smiles, the confidence of their experience radiating from them. Castellano and Whitmore, Ptarmigan Tunnel, Mark stated, his voice steady, calm, a hint of his dry wit in his eyes as he nudged Jennifer, who was already lost in contemplation of a trail poster. 3 nights, looks like perfect weather. The ranger, a man whose eyes held the same weathered wisdom as the peaks outside, nodded, confirming their permits and reviewing the benign forecast. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, no significant precipitation expected. Enjoy the solitude, he offered, a phrase that in retrospect would carry a deeper, more unsettling resonance. Mark signed the log, his signature firm and clear, a final tangible record of their presence before they stepped beyond the reach of easy communication. For now the world was simple. Trail ahead, gear secure, the woman he loved by his side. His greatest fear wasn't death, but failing to protect her, losing control in a world that often demanded it. But today, control felt absolute. They stepped onto the trail with a shared breath, the scent of pine needles, glacial melt, and damp earth filling their lungs. The initial ascent was invigorating, the rhythm of their boots on the packed earth a familiar symphony. Sunlight, crisp and clean, dappled through the dense forest canopies, painting fleeting patterns on their path. They spoke in hushed tones, pointing out a distant hawk circling high above, marveling at the vibrant alpine wildflowers clinging precariously to the rocky slopes. Jennifer, ever sensitive to subtle shifts in her environment, would pause, her head tilted, listening to the wind as it whispered through the crags, a sound that could feel exhilarating, freeing, then suddenly turned sharp, carrying a metallic tang of impending cold. Mark, though he often admired her intuition, sometimes dismissed it as poetic, focusing instead on the practicalities of their route, the precise placement of his feet. By early afternoon on July 16th, they had reached their designated campsite, a secluded spot nestled below the ptarmigan wall, overlooking a breathtaking panorama of peaks and valleys. The day had been perfect, almost impossibly so. The air, thin and sharp, carried the scent of distant snow, but the sun on their faces was warm, comforting. They pitched their tent with practiced ease, a vibrant orange against the muted greens and grays of the rock, the small, familiar rituals of setting up camp, unrolling sleeping pads, filtering water from a nearby stream, organizing their cooking gear, were imbued with a quiet contentment, the shared joy of two souls perfectly aligned in their passion. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in fiery oranges and deep purples, a profound silence began to settle. It was the kind of silence that made the distant rumble of a rockfall sound like thunder, and the whisper of the wind through the pines feel like a voice. They sat outside their tent, sharing a simple meal, watching the light recede from the highest peaks, leaving them stark and shadowed. Jennifer, her face illuminated by the dying light, pulled out her journal. The moment felt sacred, a profound connection to something ancient and timeless. Yet a subtle undercurrent of unease began to seep in, a fracture signal in the otherwise perfect evening. Mark, ever attentive, watched her as she wrote. Her brow furrowed slightly. He felt it too, this subtle shift in the atmosphere, a quiet vulnerability that seemed to cling to the deepening shadows. He checked the tent pegs again, then stared out into the vast, darkening expanse, trying to make sense of a feeling he couldn't quite pin down. It was too vast, too strange to categorize. Later inside the tent, by the glow of a headlamp, Jennifer wrote her final entry. Her hand, usually so neat, showed a slight tremor, a barely perceptible waver in the ink. The words felt like a whisper, a premonition captured on paper. The stars here are unbelievable tonight, vast and cold, stretching into forever. Mark just pointed out Orion, but I can't quite feel the comfort in it. There's a quietness up here that isn't peaceful, not like other nights. It's different. Not just the absence of sound, but a kind of presence in the silence, like it's listening. Mark feels it too. He just keeps checking the tent pegs, then staring out into the dark. I think he's trying to make sense of it, trying to pin it down, but it's too vast, too strange. The entry ended there, a sentence incomplete, a thought swallowed by the encroaching night. The headlamp clicked off. The last sliver of sun had long since dipped below the jagged peaks, plunging the world into a deep, impenetrable darkness. Inside their tent, two bright sparks of human connection settled into a quiet foreboding, unaware that the silence outside had already begun to listen and that the mountains had started to tell their story. The morning of July 18th dawned, sharp and clear over the city of Seattle, a world away from the jagged peaks where Mark and Jennifer had found their sanctuary. It was the day they were due back, a familiar comfort for Sarah Whitmore, Jennifer's older sister. Sarah, whose life in graphic design was a structured counterpoint to Jennifer's wilder spirit, usually found a quiet rhythm in these expected returns. A text message, a quick call, a shared meal recounting trail tales. These were the rituals of their sisterhood. But that morning the phone remained stubbornly silent. Sarah's initial concern was mild, easily dismissed. Perhaps they'd taken an extra hour on the trail, or found a remote spot with no signal, lost in the post-adventure glow. She made coffee, checked her work emails, her blonde hair, a shade lighter than Jennifer's auburn, neatly framing a face that usually held a soft, composed expression. But as the afternoon wore on and the expected check-in remained elusive, A subtle knot began to form in her stomach. Jennifer was meticulous, especially with Mark's pragmatic influence. Missing a return time even by a few hours felt uncharacteristic. By late afternoon, the knot had tightened into a tangible anxiety. Sarah tried their cell phones again, knowing the spotty coverage in the park, but clinging to the hope of a miraculous signal. Nothing. Just the hollow echo of a network that couldn't connect. Her mind, usually so organized, began to conjure images she pushed away, a twisted ankle, an unexpected storm. But the forecast had been benign. Mark and Jennifer were experienced, prepared. This wasn't like them. As the sun began to dip below the Seattle skyline, casting long purple shadows, Sarah's worry curdled into something colder, more insistent. Her voice, though usually warm, acquired a brittle edge as she dialed the number for Glacier National Park. The ranger on the other end was calm, methodical, but couldn't offer much. "They're due back today. We'll make a note. Give it another 24 hours, ma'am. Most folks just lose track of time." But Sarah knew, with the fierce certainty only a sister could possess, that Jennifer did not lose track of time. Not like this. The next 24 hours stretched into an agonizing eternity. Every shadow seemed to hold a phantom message, every distant siren a false alarm. Sarah paced her apartment, the silence within its walls a stark contrast to the profound quiet her sister had described in her journal. The image of Jennifer's neat hand trembling slightly as she wrote of a different silence flashed in her mind, a premonition she hadn't understood until now. By the morning of July 19th, Sarah's concern had escalated from mild worry to full-blown panic. Her call to the park that morning was no longer a request, but an urgent demand, her voice raw with a grief that had not yet found its object. It was then that Ranger Elias Thorne entered the unfolding drama. Thorne, a man whose face was carved from the very landscape he patrolled, listened with a deep-seated weariness that came from seeing the mountains claim too many lives. His eyes, a piercing blue, missed nothing, yet held the weight of decades spent navigating the often unforgiving embrace of Glacier. He was the embodiment of park authority, a man of procedure and protocol, but also one who understood the subtle, often inexplicable whims of the wild. His voice, gravelly, low, and reassuringly competent, was the first anchor Sarah found in a sea of dread. "Sarah, we've confirmed their permit. Mark Castellano and Jennifer Whitmore, Ptarmigan Tunnel Trail. Expected return was yesterday." Thorne's words were clipped, professional. "We're initiating a missing persons search. Standard protocol. We'll start with their intended route, designated campsites, and any known alternative paths." The launch of the search operation was a methodical, almost clinical response to Sarah's mounting terror. Thorne orchestrated the initial efforts with a calm efficiency, deploying ground teams, mapping out grids, and preparing for aerial reconnaissance. He clung to rational explanations: a sudden localized storm, a navigational error leading to a minor injury, altitude sickness. These were the standard narratives, the predictable dangers of a wilderness as beautiful as it was brutal. But as the first day of the search bled into the night, and the vastness and indifference of Glacier began to swallow their efforts, even Thorne felt a subtle shift in the air. The initial optimism, the familiar hum of a rescue mission, began to fray. The search teams, a mix of seasoned rangers and dedicated volunteers, pushed hard, their boots crunching on rocky trails, their voices echoing through dense forest canopies. They followed the Ptarmigan Tunnel Trail, meticulously scanning every crevice, every stand of ancient pines, every snowdrift that clung to the higher elevations even in July. For Sarah, the wait was an agonizing purgatory. She had traveled to a small hotel just outside the park, a place where the mountains loomed dark and silent through her window. Every phone call from Thorne was met with a desperate, breathless hope, only to be followed by the crushing weight of disappointment. "Nothing yet, Sarah. No sign of their camp, no discarded gear, no footprints off the main trail." Each update or lack thereof amplified the emotional toll. She pictured Jennifer, vibrant and alive, sketching in her journal, and the image felt impossibly distant, already receding into memory. Her grief was a fierce, quiet determination to understand, to find. The days turned into nights with no sign of the couple. The wilderness, so inviting to the prepared hiker, now felt like a conscious, almost sentient entity holding its secrets close. The search efforts, initially focused and hopeful, began to feel like a desperate attempt to find any trace of two lives vanished into thin air. The wind, a recurring motif in this landscape, shifted from a gentle rustle to a mournful howl, carrying across the exposed ridges not answers but only the metallic tang of impending cold, a sound that seemed to mock their urgency. False hopes, sharp and cruel, punctuated the long wait. A discarded water bottle briefly raising pulses turned out to be an old piece of refuse, a faint flash of orange in the distance quickly identified as a floral patch on a high meadow. Each time, the surge of adrenaline, the brief, exhilarating belief that they were close, was dashed against the relentless indifference of the mountain. Thorne, though outwardly composed, felt the familiar splinter in his professional pride. This wasn't adding up. Mark and Jennifer were not novices. They didn't simply vanish. The search grid expanded, covering more challenging off-trail terrain, but still yielded nothing. The scale of the park, its sheer ancient presence dwarfed human endeavor, swallowing the shouts of searchers, absorbing the drone of the helicopter that occasionally sliced through the silence. The days were brilliant, almost blinding, painting the vast slopes in greens and golds, but the nights descended with an almost palpable weight, thick with shadow and a silence that was profound, often unnerving. In this unforgiving expanse, Mark and Jennifer had simply ceased to be. The dread deepened, a cold, creeping certainty that settled over the search teams. The mission was subtly changing. The frantic energy of rescue began to give way to the grim, methodical precision of a recovery effort. Sarah, huddled in her hotel room, could feel it in Thorne's increasingly hushed tone, in the careful phrasing of his updates. They were no longer looking for two people to bring home alive, but for a story, a trace, an explanation for how two seasoned outdoor enthusiasts could simply be absorbed by a landscape that offered no easy answers. The vast, indifferent silence of Glacier continued to listen, and the mountains for now remained stubbornly mute. 3 days had passed since Mark and Jennifer were due back. 3 long days since the search had begun. The meticulous grids, the shouted names echoing into canyons, the drone of the helicopter slicing through the indifferent air, all had yielded nothing but the deepening dread that settled like a fresh snowfall on the hearts of the search teams. The optimism had curdled into grim determination, the hope of rescue giving way to the cold calculus of recovery. Ranger Thorne, his face etched with another layer of weariness, had almost exhausted the rational explanations, the familiar patterns of human error in the face of nature's power. He knew with a certainty that chilled him more than any mountain wind that this wasn't just a lost couple. This was something else. It was on the morning of July 21st, under a sky that had cleared to an almost painful blue, that the earth finally spoke. A helicopter, one of the smaller, more agile crafts, had been tasked with a final sweep of the higher, more exposed terrain, an area considered low probability given the couple's intended route. The pilot, a veteran of countless park operations, flew a steady, patient course, his gaze sweeping the jagged peaks and snow-dusted cirques near Ahern Pass. His eyes trained to spot the smallest anomaly, a flash of orange against gray rock, a misplaced footprint in a snowfield that had almost passed over the shallow ravine. But something, a subtle shift in the pristine canvas of white and stone, caught his attention. He circled back, dropping lower, the rotor wash stirring the thin air. Below, at an elevation of 8,400 feet, 2 miles off the couple's intended path, a dark shape lay partially obscured by an unexpected July snowfall. It was a cruel, almost theatrical touch from the mountains. This fresh dusting of white that had fallen sometime in the night, just enough to soften the edges of the horror it now covered. The pilot's initial confusion gave way to a cold, sinking certainty. He radioed in. The descent of the search team was swift, a grim procession of figures in bright park uniforms against the stark white canvas. They moved with a practiced efficiency that belied the growing sense of unreality. The air here was sharp, thin, carrying the metallic tang of ice and the profound silence of true alpine wilderness. As they reached the bottom of the ravine, the full horror of the scene unfolded before them, a tableau of impossible intimacy and bewildering tragedy. Mark Castellano and Jennifer Whitmore lay frozen, locked in a final tender embrace. Their bodies, stiff and still, were partially covered by the recent snow, as if the mountain itself had tried to offer a final chilling shroud. Mark's arm was wrapped around Jennifer's waist, pulling her close, her head nestled into his shoulder, her hand resting on his chest. It was a posture of desperate comfort, a final act of human connection in the face of an unimaginable end. Their faces, though marked by the unforgiving cold, held a serene, almost peaceful stillness, a profound quietness that contradicted the violence of their fate. But the scene was not merely tragic. It was profoundly, chillingly wrong. Their heavier layers, their technical jackets, their waterproof pants, lay discarded nearby, scattered like fallen leaves on the snow. They were dressed in lighter clothing, the inner layers of their hiking gear exposing them to the lethal cold. This was the unmistakable, horrifying signature of paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where victims of severe hypothermia, in the throes of their final moments, experience a delusional sensation of being overheated and strip off their clothes, accelerating their own demise. Their bodies showed the unmistakable signs of severe hypothermia, their skin waxy, their limbs rigid, their very essence stolen by the pervasive cold. The search team, hardened professionals though they were, stood in stunned silence. Ranger Thorne, who had arrived with the ground team, felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. His eyes, usually so sharp and observant, darted from the embracing couple to the discarded clothes, then to the surrounding terrain. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious injuries, no indications of an accident that would explain their bizarre state. It was a death by cold, undeniable and absolute, yet the details were an unraveling thread in the tapestry of his understanding. The horror deepened, stretching beyond the immediate visceral shock of the discovery. As the team meticulously documented the scene, a small group branched out to search the immediate vicinity. And then another call came over the radio, laced with a new, profound bewilderment. "Thorne, you need to see this." Just 200 yards away, tucked into a small, sheltered alcove overlooking the ravine, sat their tent, perfectly pitched, pristine. The vibrant orange fabric designed to stand out against the wilderness seemed to mock the scene of frozen death just beyond. It was as if Mark and Jennifer had simply stepped away for a moment, intending to return. The tent flap was slightly ajar, revealing the neatly rolled sleeping bags, unused, pristine, waiting for occupants who would never again seek their warmth. Their cooking gear was packed away, their food stored in a bare canister, their water filtration system neatly set up. It was the campsite of experienced hikers, meticulously maintained, utterly undisturbed, a sanctuary abandoned without a trace of panic or disarray. Thorne walked towards it, the crunch of his boots on the snow, the only sound in the vast quiet. He peered inside, his breath misting in the frigid air. The sleeping bags, rated for extreme cold, lay like silent accusations. The very sanctuary they had prepared, the warmth and protection they had so carefully established, had been left behind. What force, what terror, what incomprehensible lure could possibly have drawn two seasoned hikers in the dead of a July night from the safety of their perfectly pitched tent, only to ascend into the exposed, freezing alpine to die in an embrace that spoke of both love and profound disorientation. The official cause of death, even before the medical examiner's confirmation was clear: severe hypothermia. But the circumstances surrounding that death began immediately to defy all logic, all conventional understanding of a wilderness tragedy. This was not a simple fall, not an unexpected flash flood, not even a sudden, overwhelming blizzard. This was an abandonment of safety, a progression into a cold, exposed landscape, culminating in a final, intimate moment of death that seemed utterly unmoored from the available facts. News of the discovery reached Sarah Whitmore in her lonely hotel room with a phone call from Thorne. His voice, usually so steady, carried a new, strained quality. "Sarah, we found them." The words were a hammer blow, simultaneously anticipated and utterly devastating. The long, agonizing wait had ended, but not with the closure she had yearned for, only with a deeper, more profound terror. She crumpled onto the bed, the phone slipping from her numb fingers, the grief tearing through her with a visceral, physical pain. Jennifer was gone. Mark was gone. Yet, even through the crushing wave of sorrow, a sharp, cold question pierced her mind. Why? Why had they left their tent? Why the paradoxical undressing? Her sister, meticulous and prepared; Mark, pragmatic and cautious. This was not how they would have died. The image of Jennifer's journal entry, her hand trembling as she wrote of a different silence, flashed in Sarah's mind again, but now it was no longer a premonition. It was a chilling echo, a whisper from the very edge of understanding. For Thorne, too, the discovery was a splinter in his professional pride, a puzzle that defied his expertise. The Castellano-Whitmore case would become a testament to the limits of his understanding, pushing him to confront the unsettling truth that the mountains held older, colder secrets than any of them were prepared to understand. The brutal confrontation with this inexplicable reality left the search teams not with answers, but with a profound, unsettling question. The mountains had delivered their occupants, but the story they told was one of inexplicable darkness, a descent into an incomprehensible tragedy that only deepened with every new detail. The wind, now a mournful howl, carried across the exposed ridges not answers, but the unsettling whisper of something vast, something ancient, that had claimed them. The initial shock of discovery, like a sudden avalanche, gave way to a chilling, sustained tremor of questions. The grief that enveloped Sarah Whitmore in her lonely hotel room was profound, a physical ache that burrowed deep into her bones, but beneath it, a sharp, insistent voice demanded answers. Mark and Jennifer were gone, yes, but the how of their going was a twisting labyrinth of anomalies, each new piece of information only deepening the inexplicable darkness that had swallowed them. The medical examiner's report arrived with a cold, clinical certainty. Cause of death: severe hypothermia. The findings were irrefutable. Their core body temperatures had plummeted, their organs had failed, their lives extinguished by the relentless cold. Yet even this definitive conclusion was riddled with contradiction. Weather records from the days of their disappearance were meticulously reviewed, cross-referenced with satellite data and local park station readings. The temperatures in the Ahern Pass area, while certainly cool for July nights at 8,400 feet, had never dropped below 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius. Cold, yes, but not lethal for two experienced hikers, bundled in the high-performance gear they possessed, especially not within the thermal cocoon of a tent rated for sub-zero temperatures. The mountain, it seemed, had offered a swift, brutal death by cold, yet the very conditions required for such a fate simply hadn't existed. It was a paradox etched in ice. Ranger Elias Thorne, poring over the reports in his office, felt the weight of this discrepancy like a physical burden. His years of experience had taught him the brutal efficiency of the mountains, but always within a framework of logic. A sudden storm, an unexpected plunge into icy water, a prolonged exposure to extreme conditions, these he understood. But this? This was a death by cold in temperatures that should have allowed for survival, or at least for a more prolonged struggle. The image of the abandoned tent, so pristine, so ready, flashed in his mind. The discarded clothes, the paradoxical undressing. It was as if their bodies had responded to a cold that wasn't there, or to a cold that was of a different, more profound nature. Then came the GPS data, retrieved from a device found tucked into Mark's backpack, a silent digital witness to their final hours. The trace was a brutal diagram of bewilderment, a map of descent into the incomprehensible. At precisely 2:03 a.m. on July 17th, the signal showed Mark and Jennifer abruptly leaving their perfectly pitched tent. Their digital footprints moved not down to the shelter of the valley, not towards any established trail or logical escape route, but up, higher onto the exposed rock-strewn slopes of Ahern Pass into the biting July night. It was an ascent into the open, a deliberate abandonment of their sanctuary for an exposed, treacherous climb in the pitch black. The GPS recorded erratic, almost aimless movements for nearly 6 hours. Their trajectory was not that of a purposeful hike, nor even a panicked flight. It was a wandering, a stumbling, a pattern that suggested profound disorientation, or something far worse. They moved, stopped, moved again, traversing small, meaningless loops, inching ever higher towards the desolate, windswept ridgelines. The signal finally ceased just before 8 a.m., in the shallow ravine where their frozen forms would be found 4 days later, locked in their final tender embrace. What force, what terror, what incomprehensible lure had pulled them from their sleep? What had drawn them from warmth into the gathering cold, towards a summit they had no reason to reach, into a night that would become their last embrace? Jennifer's journal entry, her trembling hand writing of a different silence, a presence in the quiet, now felt less like a poetic musing and more like a chilling premonition of a profound unraveling. Toxicology reports offered no easy answers either. No drugs, no alcohol, no substances that could explain a sudden onset of irrational behavior or profound disorientation. Mark and Jennifer were clear-headed, their systems clean, but the reports did confirm elevated levels of cortisol and adrenaline in both victims. Their bodies, in their final moments, had been flooded with the primal chemicals of extreme stress, of terror, of a fight-or-flight response pushed to its absolute limit. They had been afraid profoundly and viscerally, but of what? And why had their highly attuned instincts, honed by years in the wild, failed them so spectacularly? The undisturbed campsite became a silent, damning testament to this growing paradox. The tent, pristine and perfectly pitched just 200 yards from their bodies, stood as a mocking symbol of their abandoned safety. Inside their sleeping bags, rated for extreme cold, lay neatly rolled, unused. Their cooking gear was packed away, their food secured in a bare canister, their water filtration system neatly set up. No signs of wildlife disturbance, no evidence of a struggle, no indication of any external force that might have driven them from their shelter. It was the campsite of experienced hikers, meticulously maintained, utterly undisturbed. Yet their final actions were anything but meticulous, anything but rational. They were a complete contradiction to the very essence of their preparedness, a profound break from their practiced caution. The wind, which had been a constant mournful presence since their discovery, now seemed to carry a new unsettling whisper, a hint of something unseen that had moved through the high alpine. And then another anomaly surfaced, an account that layered another unsettling dimension onto the already baffling case. A lone hiker, a seasoned backpacker making an early ascent towards Iceberg Lake, reported seeing a bright, unidentifiable light near Ahern Pass around 3 a.m. on July 17th, precisely the window of Mark and Jennifer's inexplicable ascent. The hiker interviewed by Thorne described it as a sudden, intense flash, then a sustained, eerie glow, high on the ridge, Unlike any headlamp or typical wilderness light source, it had been too bright, too steady, too other. He'd dismissed it at the time as some strange atmospheric phenomenon, or perhaps an early morning searchlight from an unseen crew. But in retrospect, after hearing of the couple's fate, the memory had returned with a chilling clarity. But the final, most haunting piece of the puzzle lay hidden for another 2 weeks, until a park volunteer sifting through the recovered gear discovered Mark's waterproof camera. Its casing was scratched, its lens slightly askew from the fall, but the memory card was miraculously intact. Thorne, along with David Castellano, Mark's older brother, who had arrived in Glacier consumed by a quiet, fierce need for answers, sat in a small park office, watching the images load onto a computer screen. The first photos were unremarkable, stunning landscapes. Jennifer's radiant smile against a backdrop of wildflowers, Mark's focused gaze on a distant peak. Then a sudden shift. After midnight on July 17th, the timestamp confirmed, the photos changed. Dozens of frames, one after another, were complete darkness. Black. Impenetrable. As if Mark had been frantically clicking the shutter in an attempt to capture something his eyes could not quite process, or in a desperate effort to illuminate a profound, unseen presence. The tension in the small room was palpable as the files scrolled by. Then suddenly, the blackness was broken. The final 3 images captured in the pre-dawn hours before their deaths were indistinct, grainy, and utterly terrifying. They showed not complete blackness, but a profound, unsettling blur. Against the deep, featureless void of the mountain night, 3 faint, elongated light sources were visible. They were not the sharp, focused beams of a headlamp, nor the diffuse glow of a distant town. They were amorphous, almost spectral, with soft edges that bled into the darkness, pulsating with an internal, unidentifiable light. They seemed to float, suspended, without origin or anchor. What were they? What were a trick of the camera? A reflection? Or were they a physical manifestation of the presence Jennifer had felt in the different silence? Mark had been trying to capture something, trying to make sense of it, trying to pin it down as Jennifer had written. And in his final moments, he had succeeded, leaving behind a chilling visual echo of the incomprehensible. The cascade of anomalies had reached a crescendo. Medical evidence contradicted weather data. GPS data showed inexplicable 6-hour wanderings. Toxicology confirmed extreme stress, yet no impairment. An untouched camp stood in stark contrast to a death by exposure. A witness saw a strange light, and now Mark's camera had captured images of unidentifiable light sources in the very darkness that had claimed their lives. The mountains had revealed their occupants, but the story they told was one of inexplicable darkness, a descent into an incomprehensible tragedy that only deepened with every new detail. The wind, now a mournful howl, carried across the exposed ridges not answers, but the unsettling whisper of something vast, something ancient, that had claimed them, leaving behind only questions that scratched at the very edge of understanding.